In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Old West, where loyalty was scarce and every day could be a fight for survival, a lone rancher lived a life shaped by hard work and quiet solitude. But one restless evening, everything changed in a way no one could have predicted. Far beyond the dusty trails and rugged hills, a warrior from a rival tribe lay dying, abandoned and broken, his fate seemingly sealed by years of bitter conflict. Yet, the rancher's choice to save this man would unravel a story of unexpected honor, fragile trust, and a debt that transcended old rivalries. As the sun dipped beneath the horizon, casting long shadows across the parched earth, the rancher's act of mercy stirred ripples that would cross tribal lines and ignite hope where there had been none. What no one foresaw was how this single decision would lead to a night filled with whispers, prayers, and the arrival of strangers carrying a secret as heavy as the weight of the past, a secret that would bind lives forever. Among them was a young girl, lost and weary, whose presence challenged everything the rancher thought he knew about fate and family. This tale isn't just about survival or grudges carried over generations. It's about the fragile threads that connect us when walls of distrust begin to crumble. It's about a promise kept under the relentless sun and the courage to believe that even in the harshest lands, redemption can find a way. In a world divided by fear and history, the unexpected arrival of this child would prove that sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places and from the hearts willing to see beyond old wounds. Prepare to step into a world where every decision carries the weight of a lifetime, and where the echoes of one act of kindness resonate through the dust and silence of the West. This is a story that will grip your soul, reveal the power of compassion, and remind us all that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with guns, but with the strength to forgive and protect. Stay with us as we unravel the unforgettable journey of a rancher, a dying warrior, and a lost daughter who would change everything. A story where the past collides with hope, and where family is found in the most unexpected places. The rancher's name was Elias Crow, a man known more for his silence than for any deeds told around a campfire. He had buried 2 brothers, survived the drought of '78, and rebuilt his land after outlaws set fire to his barn one cold winter night. He lived alone since his wife passed, with only a dog named Tuck and the wind howling across the plains to keep him company. People said he had a heart of stone, carved by loss and chiseled by time, but they didn't see what was behind those tired eyes. Elias didn't trust easily, and he sure as hell didn't stick his neck out for strangers until that fateful dusk, when he saw a body collapsed on the edge of his territory. At first, he thought it was a trap. Ambushes weren't rare, especially for men who knew how to bleed without dying. But something about the stillness of the figure, the broken arrows piercing his side, and the deep gash across his chest told a different story. Elias approached slowly, rifle aimed, heart steady, until he recognized the distinct beaded ornaments woven into the warrior's hair, a sign of the Black Crows, an old enemy of the settlers in those lands. For a split second, instinct told him to leave the man to die, to turn away and let nature take its course. But then Elias saw the warrior's eyes, glassy, yet burning with the quiet desperation of someone clinging to life not for his own sake, but for someone else's. Elias loaded the stranger onto his horse and brought him back to the cabin. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was guilt, or maybe it was the memory of the time a wandering preacher saved his own father from bleeding out decades ago. Either way, the act had already begun to stir the gears of something far greater than he could have imagined. That night, Elias cleaned the wounds, burned sage to mask the scent of blood, and sat by the fire watching over a man whose people had once taken everything from him. Somewhere deep inside, the rancher knew this was not a random encounter. It was the beginning of something that would challenge every rule he had lived by. When the warrior finally opened his eyes, he didn't speak a word. His gaze traveled across the room, stopping on the old rifle hanging above the hearth, then to Elias, who sat carving a piece of wood with methodical calm. No gratitude was shown, no fear either, just a heavy silence between men who had lost too much to pretend anymore. Elias offered him water, but the warrior refused. Instead, he placed his hand over his heart and muttered a word that Elias didn't recognize. Something sacred, something ancient. It was in that moment that the rancher realized he hadn't just saved a man. He had entered a pact, and in the Old West, pact had a weight far heavier than gold. Outside, the winds carried the scent of something unfamiliar. Coyotes howled in the distance, and a strange hush settled over the land. That night, Elias barely slept. He wasn't afraid of being attacked. He had faced far worse, but there was an unease growing in him, as if the earth itself was bracing for something. In saving the warrior, Elias had opened a door he could no longer close. And somewhere out there, in the darkness beyond the hills, something was already moving toward him, something that had been waiting a long time. By morning, the warrior had passed out again, drenched in sweat and whispering in a tongue Elias didn't understand. Fever burned through him like wildfire, and Elias had to venture into the hills to gather herbs his wife once used, bitterroot and juniper, crushed together and boiled into a strong tea. Each step he took away from the cabin filled him with unease, but the man's condition was worsening fast. He couldn't explain it, but he felt responsible, tethered to this stranger as if their fates were now braided by something unseen. When Elias returned, he found the warrior unconscious, his breathing shallow. He forced the bitter tea down his throat and stayed by his side through the day, changing the bandages, whispering things he hadn't spoken aloud in years, about loss, about his daughter, about the war that took her and left a wound no doctor could mend. The cabin, once a place of silence and solitude, now echoed with memories Elias had buried deep. It was as if nursing this man was drawing his own ghost to the surface, one painful memory at a time. 3 nights later, the sound of drums echoed faintly across the mesa, a low, steady rhythm that chilled Elias to the bone. He stepped outside, rifle in hand, scanning the horizon. Torches flickered in the distance. Not many, but enough to send a message. The Black Crows knew. They had come not with rage, but with ritual. Elias watched in silence as the figures approached, slow and deliberate, until a small group reached the edge of his property. He held his ground, unsure whether to expect blood or peace. One of them stepped forward, an elder with white braids and eyes like ice. In his arms, he carried something wrapped in deer hide. The others stood in solemn silence as the old man placed the bundle on the ground and stepped back. Elias approached cautiously, heart pounding, hands trembling. When he unwrapped the cloth, the breath caught in his throat. It was a girl, no older than 8, with hair the color of fire and eyes identical to the ones Elias saw every time he looked in the mirror. She stared up at him, wordless, holding a carved wooden horse, one he had made for his daughter the year she disappeared. Elias dropped to his knees. The world spun around him. This wasn't just a coincidence. This child, this sacred moment, it was a return, a full circle drawn by the hand of something far greater than he could comprehend. The girl clung to his arm like she had known him all her life. And behind her, the elder finally spoke in broken English. She was lost. Now she's returned. Debt is paid. Elias looked back at the cabin, at the warrior he had saved, and understood. That man had given up his own secret to bring her home. The child's name was Nita, though Elias hadn't heard that name before. Her voice was barely above a whisper, and she spoke in a mix of broken English and the soft, melodic dialect of the Black Crows. Every word she uttered made Elias feel as though time had folded it on itself. He didn't need proof. Her eyes were enough. They held the same flicker of light his daughter had, the same quiet resilience. Years ago, she had been taken during a raid. He'd buried the grief, so deep it hardened into silence. But now, here she was, alive, breathing, clutching the very toy he thought had burned in the fire that ruined his family. Elias tried to make sense of it all, but the pieces didn't fit into any logic he'd ever known. How had she survived? Why hadn't they come sooner? The elder didn't answer these questions directly. Instead, he told Elias that the warrior, whose name was Tahu, had found the girl abandoned during a skirmish. He had raised her in secret, protected her even as his own people questioned his loyalty. It was Tahu who had taught her to survive, who had carried her miles through the desert to bring her back when he realized the time had come. His wounds weren't from battle. They were from betrayal. He had fought his own kind to return Elias's daughter home. Inside the cabin, Tahu stirred, his breathing ragged but steady. Elias brought Nita to his side, and she knelt by the bed, placing her small hand over the warrior's. Her lips trembled as she whispered something only he could understand, and a faint smile crossed his battered face. Elias felt something crack inside him. Not pain, not sorrow, but the slow thaw of a heart that had been cold for too long. He couldn't explain it, but a piece of him, the best piece, had just come back from the dead. That evening, the tribe made camp just beyond the ridge, giving Elias space but not leaving completely. It was a gesture of peace, of respect, maybe even protection. Elias sat on the porch, Nita curled beside him under a wool blanket, and watched the stars blink open in the sky. He had questions, 1,000 of them, but he held them back. For now, it was enough just to feel her heartbeat against his side. It was the first time in over 8 years that he hadn't felt alone. And somewhere beyond the flickering firelight, among the low chants and shadows cast by dancing flames, Elias began to understand something sacred, that the desert had taken much from him, but it had also given something back. Not through force or revenge, but through sacrifice and grace. In the Old West, debts were settled not with coin or cattle, but with blood, silence, and the courage to do what was right when no one was watching. Days passed, and Tahu's strength began to return. He spoke little, but his eyes watched everything. Elias, who had once sworn to never trust another man again, especially not one from a rival tribe, found himself relying on this warrior for guidance. They worked side by side in silence, mending fences, gathering water, repairing the stable. Nita followed them everywhere, soaking up every word, every gesture, as if her soul were stitching itself together through their quiet unity. The townsfolk began to whisper. Some said Elias had gone mad. Others claimed he was being manipulated. But a few, the ones who knew the weight of loss, simply tipped their hats and said nothing. When Elias rode into town with Nita sitting proud on the saddle before him, no one dared challenge the look in his eyes, fierce, protective, and reborn. He wasn't just a rancher anymore. He was a father again, and fathers in the Old West didn't break easy. Tahu's story slowly unfolded through the cracked lens of shared labor and mutual respect. He spoke of a dream, a vision given to him by the tribe's elder, of fire swallowing the horizon and a child crying in the smoke. He had believed for years it meant war, but when he found Nita among the ashes of a burned settlement, he understood. The dream was a call, a prophecy he could not ignore. Saving her had cost him everything, his status, his tribe, his peace. But he had done it without hesitation. Elias listened, sometimes with clenched fists, sometimes with tears he wiped away before they could be seen. The two men didn't need to speak often. The land spoke for them. The creak of leather saddles, the rhythm of hooves against stone, the wind that carried whispers of a past neither could change. Slowly, their bond became something sacred, forged not in blood, but in the healing silence of men who had lost too much to hate anymore. One evening, under a sky burning gold with sunset, Elias carved a new wooden horse for Nita. She sat cross-legged at his feet, watching in awe. When he handed it to her, she clutched it like a treasure. "Papa," she whispered, almost afraid the word might break the moment. Elias closed his eyes and let the weight of that word settle into his bones. It was more than a name. It was a redemption he never believed he deserved. The peace on Elias's land didn't go unnoticed. Word spread across the neighboring territories about a rancher and a warrior from rival bloodlines working together. Some saw it as a sign of change. Others saw it as betrayal. And then there were those who saw it as an opportunity. Men with scars, grudges, and hearts still burning with the fire of old wars. Among them was Roy Banner, a former scout turned drifter who had once lost a brother to the Black Crows. When he heard of Tahu's presence on Elias's land, he saddled up with 2 others and rode out with one intention: to settle what he called unfinished justice. Elias had fortified his ranch in the past, but now it wasn't just about protecting property. It was about protecting a family, a fragile peace, and the very soul of a land trying to heal. He posted a watch at night, taught Nita how to recognize danger in the winds, and trusted Tahu to read the signs others ignored. One morning, they found tracks near the creek, fresh, deliberate. Tahu's face hardened. "They're not just passing through," he said. "They're watching." Instead of panicking, Elias prepared. He wasn't the same man he was years ago. He had grown stronger not in muscle, but in conviction. His ranch had become more than a patch of dry earth and wooden fences. It had become a sanctuary, one worth fighting for. But unlike before, this fight wasn't about vengeance. It was about preserving something rare, understanding between enemies, the bond of blood regained, and the fragile thread of love that had returned to him in the form of a child's quiet smile. Tahu stood beside him every step, not as a guest, not even as a friend, but as a brother. Their silence, once filled with mistrust, now echoed with the unspoken oath of men who had both tasted deep loss and refused to let it come again. They trained Nita how to stay hidden, how to read the land, and even how to send smoke signals to the tribe over the ridge. The Black Crows had not left. They watched from afar, offering their own quiet guard, ready if needed. The storm came before dawn. 3 riders, cloaked in dust and hate, approached the ranch slow and steady. They didn't fire a warning shot. They came to take. But Elias was ready. Not with rage, not with bloodlust. He stood tall with Tahu beside him, both men unshaken. Nita watched from the loft, clutching her wooden horse, not in fear, but in trust. For the first time in years, she knew she wasn't alone. Roy Banner shouted first, calling Elias a traitor, a fool, a man blinded by sentiment. He spoke of debts, of bloodlines, of the sins of tribes and the silence of settlers. Elias didn't flinch. "This man saved my daughter," he said. "That makes him more kin than any man who speaks only of the past." Roy drew his rifle, and, for a second, the desert held its breath. Then came a crack from the hills, not gunfire, but a signal flare from the Black Crows. Within seconds, shadows emerged from the canyon, warriors on horseback, torches lit, forming a silent perimeter around the ranch. Roy froze. He hadn't come for war, but neither had he come for peace. He was a man torn between memory and fear. His companions hesitated, sensing the weight of the moment. Tahu stepped forward, slow and calm, and held out the beaded necklace he wore, the same one Elias had seen the first night. "Your brother wore this," Tahu said. "He died saving 2 children from a burning house, one of them mine." The truth struck harder than any bullet. Roy's grip loosened. The rifle lowered. In the stillness that followed, something ancient dissolved. Not fully, but enough to allow a different future to take root. Roy turned without a word, mounted his horse, and rode off into the rising sun. The others followed. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. Tahu looked to the horizon, then to Nita, and finally to Elias. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. Peace had won, for now. Days passed in strange quiet. Nita resumed her laughter, chasing chickens around the yard, her braids flying in the wind. Elias planted a new row of corn, and Tahu built a stone marker near the creek. Not a grave, but memorial. "For what we've lost," he said, "and what we chose to protect." Every evening, they sat by the fire as a family. No one told stories, but the silence between them felt full, not empty. And in that quiet rhythm of soil, sweat, and stars, something sacred bloomed. It wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about facing it with open eyes and choosing not to repeat it. The desert still carried ghosts, but on Elias's land, there was now a new sound, the heartbeat of a home rebuilt not by bloodlines, but by grace. The weeks that followed carried with them a stillness unlike anything Elias had ever known. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes before a storm. It was deeper, more peaceful, like the land itself was finally breathing again. Every morning, Nita would rise with the sun, feeding the chickens and fetching water from the creek, her tiny boots kicking up dust in the same paths Elias had once walked alone. Now, those paths were different, filled with her humming, her laughter, and the kind of joy that only a child who had found her way home could bring. Tahu became more than just a guest. He became a presence, solid, dependable, and rooted in the soil like an old oak. He taught Nita how to track footprints, how to read the stars, how to listen to the wind for warnings. Elias watched them with a quiet pride that surprised even himself. The warrior who had once represented everything he feared was now shaping the future of his daughter, guiding her with hands that had once drawn a bow in war, now softened by mercy. But change never came easy in the West. One afternoon, a letter arrived from the federal marshal in Abilene. Someone had filed a complaint, anonymous but detailed. It accused Elias of harboring a fugitive, of consorting with a hostile tribe, and of endangering the settlement's peace. Elias read the letter twice, then burned it in the fire. He knew what it meant. Soon, there would be visitors from the law. And while he had nothing to hide, he also knew that justice out here wasn't always blind, especially when old wounds were still festering beneath the surface. He prepared the land like a soldier before battle, not with weapons, but with honesty. He wrote down every detail of what happened, how he found Tahu, how Nita was returned, how peace was kept when violence could have erupted. He had Tahu add his mark beside it, a symbol from his tribe that meant truth. They both knew it might not be enough. Out here, truth was often buried under fear, and men preferred their stories simple. Heroes in white, enemies in red. But Elias had seen enough to know that the real stories were always far more complicated. As the sun set that evening, casting long golden fingers across the dry fields, Elias sat with Nita on the porch. She leaned her head on his shoulder and whispered, "Are they coming to take him away?" Elias didn't lie. "Maybe," he said, "but they'll have to get through me first." And in that promise, spoken not with anger but with unwavering resolve, the Old West saw something rare, a man standing not just for what was his, but for what was right. When the marshals arrived, they came with polished boots and cold eyes, riding under a banner of law that had often failed men like Elias. Their leader, a young man named Clay Hollister, wore a tin star that glinted in the sun like a blade. He stepped on the porch and asked to see Tahu. Elias didn't flinch. "He's inside, resting," he said plainly. Hollister pulled a folded paper from his coat, an order of detainment. "He's wanted for desertion and for aiding enemies of the state," the marshal said. "I'm here to take him in." Elias didn't move. "He's not a deserter. He's a protector. He saved my daughter's life." Hollister raised an eyebrow, amused but unmoved. "That might be true, sir. But out here, truth doesn't always change the law." Before Elias could reply, the door creaked open, and Tahu stepped out. His posture was straight, his face calm. "I'll go," he said softly, "but only if you listen first." Hollister looked surprised. "You get 1 minute." Tahu spoke slowly, his voice even. He told them about the night he found Nita, about the fire, the raid, the choice he made to leave his tribe and raise the girl in silence. He described the long journey, the wounds, the sacrifice. Hollister listened, arms crossed. When Tahu finished, the porch fell quiet. Nita ran out, clinging to Tahu's leg. "Don't take him," she cried. "He's my family." And for the first time, something cracked in the young marshal's expression. Hollister looked to Elias, then back at Tahu. "This wasn't in the report," he muttered. "No, I bet it wasn't," Elias said, "because no one wanted to hear this part." There was a long silence, the kind that tests a man's soul. Finally, Hollister took the paper, tore it in half, and let the wind carry it away. "I'll mark it resolved. Just keep your peace out here, Crow. We can't afford another war." With that, the marshals turned and rode off, leaving a silence behind them that buzzed with relief. That night, there were no words, just the crackle of the fire, the sound of Nita's gentle breathing, and the deep, silent bond between two men who had both been saved by a single, unselfish act. In the heart of a land where grudges often buried generations, forgiveness had found a way to bloom. With the law gone and peace reaffirmed, Elias's ranch entered a new season, not marked by rain or harvest, but by something far rarer in those parts: harmony. The land, once marked by loss and solitude, now carried the sounds of laughter, the creak of saddle leather under a rising sun, and the quiet comfort of shared labor. Nita grew stronger, more confident, her voice now fluent in both her father's language and the soft rhythm of Tahu's native tongue. She ran the fence lines barefoot, fed the horses before dawn, and always returned to the cabin before dark with a flower or feather clutched tight in her hand, her gifts for the man who never stopped waiting for her. Elias, once stiff with the weight of years and grief, began to move with a different kind of strength. Not the brute force of a ranch hand or a fighter, but the calm steadiness of someone who had made peace with his ghosts. He laughed more. He sat longer at dinner. And in the evenings, he carved small wooden toys, horses, wolves, stars, not for distraction, but to pass on the same patient wisdom that had once carried him through sorrow. Tahu watched it all with the gaze of a man who had lived through fire and chose not to become ash. But even in peace, the desert tested its dwellers. One morning, a flash flood tore through the lower pasture, cutting off the cattle trail and threatening the herd. Elias and Tahu worked without pause, shoulders soaked, boots buried in mud, hands bloodied from rope and splinters. Nita stood on higher ground, signaling with flags they'd taught her, guiding the animals to safer land. It was a dance, man, land, child, bound by something no storm could wash away. Afterward, they collapsed in the barn, soaked and breathless, but alive. Tahu looked at Elias and said, "Your land is strong because your heart has roots now." Elias chuckled, brushing mud from his beard. "Took me long enough." They sat in silence, breathing in the scent of wet hay and clean air. There was no need to say more. In the West, survival was its own kind of language, and they were fluent. That night they feasted. Nothing grand, just beans, cornbread, and dried meat. But the fire was warm, and Nita's stories danced through the room like wind through pine. Outside, the stars shimmered brighter than usual, as if the heavens themselves were tipping their hats to a rancher, a warrior, and the little girl who had brought them both back to life. Seasons shifted, as they always did. The grasses grew golden, then brittle. Snow dusted the mountains. Coyotes called from farther out, as if respecting the invisible line drawn around Elias's land. The world kept turning, but the ranch, and what it represented, became something different in the eyes of the region. Travelers started to stop by, not for water or directions, but for stories. They had heard of the rancher who raised a girl rescued by his enemy. Some wanted to see if it was true. Others just wanted to believe something good could still happen in the West. One day, a wagon appeared with a preacher and his wife, both gray-haired and tired from the road. They asked to rest beneath the shade. Elias welcomed them. Over a shared meal, the preacher said, "I've seen too many graves dug because men wouldn't lay down their pride. But here, I see grace." Elias simply nodded. He didn't need praise. He only needed his girl safe and the fire burning. As the years passed, Tahu remained. He never asked for land, never claimed a corner of the house. Yet he became part of its frame, the post that never rotted, the quiet wind that carried warning and wisdom alike. Together, the two men worked, aged, and taught. And Nita, full of fire and patience, grew into the kind of woman legends in the West were made of, fierce with a rifle, kind with a word, and unwavering in the belief that family wasn't made by blood, but by the choices we make in the hardest moments. Sometimes, riders would still come through, old ghosts in new boots, but none stayed long. The energy around the ranch was different. You could feel in your chest, like the land itself was guarded by something older than fences or guns. Folks said the spirits of those who gave everything to protect what mattered most watched over that stretch of earth. Spirits born of sacrifice, mercy, and an oath that no lawman could write down. And so the story lived on, passed from fire to fire, from ranch to saloon, from father to son. The tale of Elias Crow, the warrior Tahu, and the daughter lost and found again. A story that didn't end in bullets or revenge, but in a truth too rare for most to believe, that in the wild, unforgiving heart of the Old West, sometimes, grace finds a way home. In the Old West, where justice was often served by the barrel of a gun and love was buried beneath dust and duty, few stories dared to end in peace. But the tale of Elias Crow, the warrior Tahu, and a child who bridged two broken worlds defied every expectation. It wasn't about who drew first or who had the strongest name. It was about who was willing to put down the past and build something sacred from the ashes. A rancher chose mercy. A warrior chose loyalty. And a daughter, thought lost to the wind, became the living thread that mended two men fractured by time. Their choices weren't easy. They came with judgment, threats, and the ever-present ghosts of what had been taken. But even the fiercest deserts bloom when rain finally falls. That's what happened on that lonely patch of land. A bloom. Not loud, not sudden but steady. A life rebuilt not with vengeance, but with hands calloused by work and hearts humbled by grief. That's the kind of strength the frontier rarely saw, the kind born not of power, but of forgiveness. Perhaps that's the lesson we often miss in our own lives. We carry our past like a rifle slung over the shoulder, ready to fire at anyone who reminds us of what we've lost. But what if we dared, like Elias, to see beyond the pain? What if we stood still long enough to listen, not to the noise of anger, but to the quiet courage of healing? Sometimes, the most radical thing a person can do is open the door to someone they once called enemy and let the truth sit at their table. And maybe that's why this story matters. Because it proves that no matter how far gone we think things are, no matter how deep the divide, how sharp the wound, there's still a path back. But it takes something real. It takes the guts to forgive, the faith to believe again, and the patience to let the soil of old hatred grow something new. That ranch didn't change the West, but it reminded it what was possible. And maybe, just maybe, that's all it takes. If this story stirred something in your heart, if it reminded you of the quiet power of compassion, or made you rethink what it means to protect those we love, then let it live on. Tap the like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe to the channel. These aren't just stories, they're reminders that even in the harshest places, kindness can take root and change everything.